I would like to welcome all of you here in our 22nd edition of our webinars. We look today on temporary employment, migration in an area of temporary employment. I'm very pleased to do the webinar together with Christiane Kupsch. She is a NUPS member and she works at ILO. We focus on a very important topic. I want to give you some introduction. Give you some introduction. The idea of our NUPS webinar series is that we tackle and tangle issues of migration and integration. We want to highlight the chances of long-term oriented proactive migration governance. We want to offer food for thought through international comparison, and the focus is on the German-Canadian comparison, as we have a SEMI agreement, which is a structured exchange on migration and integration. And how do we do that? We present short pitches. We ask the outstanding colleagues, outstanding experts, leading experts in the field to give us their input, and we give an overview on the current discussion rather than a deep dive. So this is what we are going to do also in this webinar. We are short on time, so I'm very quick here. 6 to 8 speakers will give their insights for about 6 to 8 minutes. We then have time for discussion. We will record this event, but not the discussion, of course. So the speakers are recorded. What do we talk about? What are we speaking about? If we look on the World Development Report on Migration, Migrants and Refugees and Societies by the World Bank, they are speaking of safe, orderly and regular migration routes. And this reminds us to the Global Compact of Migration, of course. I mean, they basically say that the motives of migrants should be matched with the needs of the destination countries. So a match motive matrix is provided, forming categories of migrant movements from privileged forms of migration mobility to refugees. And in this framework of the World Bank, the role of temporary migration regimes is praised for migrants seeking legal status and work authorization, and for the employers who seek flexible labor. But what is not said or what is not spoken about is the financial and social costs of temporary migration movements, and they are high, as we will see. The realities on the ground are a bit different. So we have an inherently vulnerable structure of temporary labor regimes. We are going to speak about that. This is why we think it's important. Even if skilled, temporary workers are often working in inhumane conditions. Their visa are tied to the employer. The countries of origin have little bargaining power. We have both state and private companies at destinations which remake the skill categorization according to their requirements. So we can say in a way that temporary work fuels precarity if it's not done well. And what is most exploitative is maybe the kafala system. I'm not sure if we are going to speak about it, but it's there. And we are happy to invite Christiane Kupsch and Fabiola Mires, who have done a great work to put together this book we are speaking about on temporary labor migration towards social justice. And this is part, I think, of the fair migration agenda, which has been launched by ILO about 10 years ago, with the goal to recognize that migrant workers make contributions to our society. And you will see, and this is why we asked the colleagues, so Christiane and Fabiola as the editors and some of the authors, to speak about definitions, to speak about how to integrate more genuine international trade and mobility agreements, and which frameworks can we use. So how does migration relate to social justice? And I promise to be very quick here. We have brilliant speakers. We have first Christiane and Fabiola presenting the book, the outline of the book. We have then the authors, Richard Cholowinski, we have Daniel Costa, we have Aurelia Segatti. They will speak about the book, about their chapters, and will give us their insights. We then have, I promised also that we have a German-Canadian comparison here. We have Jenna Hennebury from the Wilfrid Laurier University, Paul Silly School in Canada. She's the founder of the Gender and Migration Hub also. She has, since 25 years, she told us before, a focus on temporary work. And we promised to have Markus Bücher. Unfortunately, he's at the regional directorate north of the German Federal Employment Agency. He had to cancel in the last moment on Friday night, and so we decided that I would jump in and speak about the German situation. So this is what we are going to do in the next hour or so, and I would like to invite Christiane on the floor now. Thank you.
And yes, thank you very much for having us here, because this book came out in late February, and we are very happy that this is actually one of the first places where we can present some of the content of this book. And let me immediately start by looking at why do we have a new ILO book on temporary labor migration? In November 22, the ILO's governing body discussed temporary labor migration, and in preparing a background document for this discussion, we realized the need to clarify the different forms and dimensions of temporary labor migration that make this topic so complex. Now, policymakers usually have a very uneasy relationship with complexity, so there was demand for further research and evidence to break down this complexity into more manageable parts, if you like. And also the decent work deficits experienced by many temporary labor migration are well documented, and Felicitas, you just alluded to this. But the advances in policy design to improve the situation of migrant workers are far less known, we believe. And therefore, this book provides new research on innovative policy in light of the many transformations shaping temporary movements today, such as protracted conflicts, environmental degradation, shifting production patterns, and the expansion of free trade agreements as well. And another factor is that at the current juncture, there are many discussions of expanding legal pathways for migrant workers, notably as a means to reduce irregular migration. Now, temporary programs are sometimes considered as ways to achieve just this. And in this context, we find it very important to strike a fair balance between the different interests that are involved in the design of such programs. The chapter authors or the chapters of this book are written by an interdisciplinary group of experts, so that we have a lot of fresh reflections on the many dimensions precisely that need to be considered: law, politics, economics, social development, and plenty of other dimensions, actually. The book has, the book has 4 parts. And we have the pleasure here, you already mentioned that, to have 3 chapter authors today, this afternoon, to sort of represent some of the 3 of the parts at least. Part 1 is about transient categories and shifting paradigms and their policy implications. I'll get it. This part calls for greater awareness precisely of the limitations of definitions and a better understanding of their transience, because we always have to keep in mind, including in today's discussion, that there is no universal definition of temporary labor migration. And this is why in the first chapter, Ronald Skeldon reminds us of the fact that definitions and categories of labor migration are both what he calls issues of space and time. They vary from country to country, and they also shift over time within countries, because definitions are mainly created for administrative purposes. Yet, the category in which a migrant falls upon entry into the country of destination makes a great difference for that person in their daily lives, because there are different rights attached to different categories. The fact that definitions of migrants cannot always capture social realities is also very nicely illustrated in chapter 3 by Christian Schramm, who traces labor mobilities within the European Union. And Christian Schramm highlights how labor migration projects are always open to change and depend very much, of course, on conditions in origin, transit, and stress destination countries. And interestingly, he develops types of labor migrants that can inform policy to be able to provide targeted services to migrants. For example, in the areas of integration, but also in reintegration of temporary labor migrants. And we will hear all about chapter 2 and shifting paradigms on temporary labor migration, for instance, in global debates from our colleague Richard Kolevinsky, who I've seen is here. And so no more on that chapter from me here now, but thank you, Richard, for joining us. Part 2 of the book broadens the debate by incorporating emerging areas that impact migration governance, such as international trade, the growth of mobility programs, and the complexity of forced migration and mixed flows. In chapter 4, we have Lea Vosko, who explains how in Canada there is a distinction that is being made between international mobility programs that were initially created linked to trade agreements and more traditional temporary foreign worker programs, with the assumption that mobile people need less protection than migrants. And this is an interesting aspect because Lea Vosko shows how there is not all that much difference in terms of labor market insecurity between the two types of programs. And she sees the danger of overlooking the protection needs of ever-increasing numbers of mobile workers under the international mobility programs. Very similarly, Sandra Lavenet, Mariana Alvarado, Paula Hofmeier-Slotnick, and Philip Lutz question business mobility as a privileged form of temporary labor migration. Business mobility very often happens outside of the regular labor market. And the authors of chapter 5 underline that a combination of temporary work contract and then the exemption from the destination country's domestic labor market bears structural risks, including discrimination in comparison to locally hired people. For example, for the business migrants, there's no pathway for a permanent stay in the host countries most often. As with migration that occurs under trade agreements, the movement of people who flee their homes because of armed conflict, organized violence, or life-threatening disasters is usually also not looked at as temporary labor migration by either academia or the policymakers, as Ludger Pries and Berna Sulfika-Savic so in chapter 6. Such forced migration, as they call it, frequently extends over considerable time spans, and the migrants end up becoming forced temporary labor migrants, as Ludger Pries and Berna Sulfika call it, because they need to sustain themselves and their family. And in view of growing numbers of such migrants, Pries and Sulfika call for including this group of migrants also in the discussions, in any discussions about the protection of temporary labor migrants. And here, yes, the protection, how to better protect temporary labor migrants is indeed the central question for the authors of part 3 of the book, although they examine quite different measures of protection. Among them, the politically quite sensitive issue of untying workers from their employers, also called visa portability. And we have Daniel Costa here today, who will enlighten us about the realities of visa portability. Thank you, Daniel, for being here. And so I will only say a few words about the other 2 chapters in part 3. In chapter 7, Natalia Popova shows how policy coherence and the involvement of the social partners in migration policy making are very crucial elements in addressing challenges in the design and implementation of temporary labor migration programs, thus leading to better outcomes for temporary migrant workers if you have these policy coherence and the social partners involved. And one of the key messages of chapter 9 by Sophia Kagan, and this is a message that also transpires elsewhere in the book, is that protective tools may sometimes look very good on paper, but implementation is what really matters. This chapter is about migration diplomacy between African and Middle Eastern countries and brings to the fore that the signature of bilateral labor agreements alone does not change the life of migrant workers. And Sophia Kagan notably says that monitoring mechanisms are what is really very, very crucial in this respect. And finally, part 4 takes a longer term view on temporary labor migration, and we're trying here to do some learning from the past to prepare for the future. And it is my great pleasure to welcome our colleague Aurelia Segatti, who will present ideas to this effect in relation to North African temporary labor migration to Europe. Thank you, Aurelia, for coming in later. And in chapter 11, Etienne Piguet gives us a lesson sort of about the structural need of migrant workers. This is very important, also a message that comes through the book again and again. And he does this in comparing historical and current forms of temporary labor migration programs in Switzerland, and in also reflecting on the tensions between temporary labor migration programs and the fundamental rights of immigrants. Plus, he gives us some insights on the role that origin countries can play in securing better conditions for migrant workers. He looks at Italy-Swiss relations in the past. And let me end my summary of book highlights here, sort of with a very positive takeaway from the last chapter of the book by Johanna Howie, namely that it is possible to redesign migration frameworks that include the principles of fairness and social dialogue. Australia embarked on a migration review in 22-23, and Johanna Hovey, who was one of the 3 independent experts who carried out this review, shows in chapter 12 how the application to migration law of the idea of a fair go, as it exists in Australian labor law, should help with countering the tendency for migration law to divide labor law's worker protective mission. And with this, over to my co-editor, Fabiola Mieres, on some of the intersections of temporary labor migration and social justice to give some justice to the title of our book. Thank you.
Thank you, Christiane. And I don't have a lot of time, but I thank the organizers of this webinar to have us. And in the last concluded chapter, we start with an important question and difficult one, which is, can temporary labor migration be reconciled with the principles of social justice? Some argue that temporary labor migration inherently conflicts with social justice due to the persistent and well-documented restrictions that limit migrant workers' freedom and agency. In contrast, others contend that temporary migration advances global justice by providing labor market opportunities to migrant workers and enhancing global welfare. This is a heated debate that has preoccupied philosophers for many years. So we stand between the 2 perspectives. Our edited collection provides in its concluding chapter a summary of the key findings, building upon the dimensions identified by the ILO's Director General's report, Advancing Social Justice. So this is an important topic for the ILO at the moment. And these dimensions are, of course, interrelated. And even though they rest on philosophical foundations, the chapter moves on to a more practical turn by giving reflections that can serve both scholars and practitioners. And these are the ideas reflected in our little framework here. The first dimension addresses the relationship among universal human and labor rights and capabilities. We argue that achieving social justice requires addressing the sources of vulnerability rooted in legal frameworks of both immigration and labor laws. For instance, critically engaging with visa portability, as Daniel Costa does, represents an important step forward. Furthermore, effectively ensuring labor protection that meet the diverse needs of migrant workers across various statuses calls us to treat human rights as inseparably from labor rights. International human rights and labor standards, in principle, apply to all migrant workers, irrespective of the duration of stay in the destination country, and do not privilege workers based on their skill levels, an issue that came up in the chat, and I think we'll talk about more later. Human and labor rights provide entitlements to key capabilities, notably equality of treatment and non-discrimination. These are points which we'll hear more on from Richard Cholewinski, present here today. In our second dimension, we ask, how to realize access to opportunities and equal treatment for temporary migrants, another thorny area. We suggest that temporary labor migration programs should consider, when appropriate, incorporating measures that would render them as stepping stones towards forms of labor migration of a permanent nature, while recognizing the need to prepare national workers to meet future labor demands. The possibility of longer durations of stay would also contribute to the social inclusion of migrants in the host societies where they live and work. As Stephen Castles once pointed out back in 2004, the failure to grant social rights to any group of residents leads to social divisions that can undermine the rights of the majority. Aurelia Segatti, our colleague, will further elaborate on the implication of this perspective for social protection. The third dimension is fair distribution. Fair distribution concerns, among other factors, the distributional outcomes, of course, once migrants are in the host society. Here we advance that there is a way to recognize the value of their work by making labor market institutions inclusive of migrant workers in order to address inequality. But also, when we analyze what fair distribution entails, we need to engage once again with the structure of labor markets and how the constant fissuring of the workplace and segmentation have created migrant sectors that are structurally dependent on migrant workers. The nature of labor markets and the notions of labor shortages that underpin the demands for temporary labor need to be reassessed. Proponents of temporary labor migration assume that labor shortages exist, but offer little or sometimes no concrete evidence to demonstrate that these shortages are real. Thus, resorting to temporary labor migration only when shortages are legitimate will prevent the lowering of wages and job quality. We have some findings on that. And finally, we end with a big call. We need to conduct more research on the nature of the transformations that are taking place in terms of population dynamics, climate change, mobility, technological shifts, and falling all under the rubric of just transitions. This is an area that our book hasn't explored at depth, so we invite more contributors to do this for us as well. Social justice is not a given, and the contributions in this volume provide innovative ideas and cases that hopefully will further inspire your work as well as the work of future generations. I thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar. Thank you. Back to Felicitas.
Christiane and Fabiola, that's been excellent. It's an exciting book. And the other speakers also arrived, and I would hand over to Richard Cholowinski, please.
Essentially, I will speak to the chapter in the book on temporary labor migration, which is called Back to the Future. And here I'm looking at temporary labor migration in the context of international standards, global policy dialogues on migration governance, as well as the Global Compact on migration. So over to the next slide, please. And essentially, what this chapter in the book tries to do is to look at temporary labor migration in the context of international legal frameworks as they pertain to migrants and migrant workers, as well as global policy dialogues on migration governance. It also looks at some of the policy positions on temporary labor migration by non-governmental stakeholders, including ILO, tripartite constituents, workers and employers organizations, as well as civil society. And then the chapter concludes by looking at temporary labor migration in the context of the Global Compact on migration. So starting, next slide, please, with the international legal frameworks. Next slide. Essentially here, we look at a range of standards within the ILO, so-called fundamental principles and rights at work, which deals with rights like freedom of association, non-discrimination, abolition of child labor, forced labor, as well as the right to a safe and healthy working environment, as well as specific ILO standards relating to migrant workers. And then on the international human rights side, looking at the core international human rights instrument, and particularly the core instrument dealing with the protection of migrant workers. Now, in this short presentation, I don't have time to go into detail, but let's just go over the principal findings in looking at this legal framework. So over to the next slide. And here, essentially what we find is that these frameworks apply to all migrant workers, regardless of whether they've come to a country to work for a short period or for a longer period. They do not distinguish or give more favorable treatment to migrant workers who are more skilled or who have a more favorable status. It is possible to distinguish between temporary and permanent migrants, but this possibility is limited, particularly when it comes to labor standards. And finally, these frameworks do not interfere with the sovereign prerogative of states to determine migration policy when it comes to admission, although they do give some consideration to enabling temporary migrant workers to switch to a more secure status. So that's in a nutshell what the legal framework says when it comes to a migration for employment, temporary employment as well as permanent employment. Very little differences between the two categories. So over to the next slide, please, and looking at global policy discussions, and the next slide. And here, firstly, starting with global dialogues on migration governance. And really, the most important document here really was the 2005 report of the Global Commission on International Migration, because this report laid the ground for recognizing temporary migration as well as circular migration as an important tool for promoting development, particularly in countries of origin. But importantly, the report also drew attention to the need to design temporary labor migration programs by giving sufficient protection to migrant workers, as well as giving voice to the actors in the world of work, namely workers and employers' organizations. And it also recognized the relevance of permanent migration. So this was an important starting point in the global dialogues over the last 20 years or so. And since then, what really occurred was that there became a greater focus on temporary labor migration as a tool for development, particularly in the high-level dialogues on migration and development, which interestingly do not reference temporary migration a lot, although they do refer to circular migration. They were certainly very much at the core of the discussions of the Global Forum Migration and Development, which was one of the outcomes, in fact, the outcome of the first high-level dialogue. And also in the UN Summit for Refugees and Migrants and the New York Declaration, which gave rise to the two global compacts on migration and refugees, there are limited references to temporary labor migration, mainly in the context of circular migration. But essentially what we saw in the global dialogues on migration and governance was recognition of both kinds of migration, temporary and permanent, in the GCIM report, but very much then the focus shifted to temporary labor migration and its benefits for development, particularly in countries of origin. Now, when it comes to the ILO discussions, and this is the next slide, which of course on a tripartite basis involving both not just governments, but also workers and employers, delegates, organizations, what we find there, and again, the focus here is on essentially the 21st century from last 20 years or so, is that while the ILO dialogues, of course, very much focus on the legal framework, its framework of international labor standards. So in discussions on temporary labor migration within the ILO policy discussions, very much protection of migrant workers came to the fore, but also a concern that temporary workers or migrant workers should fill temporary jobs, jobs that are in reality temporary and not should come in to fill permanent jobs. And the role of social dialogue in policy development in this area, not surprisingly, is emphasized in these dialogues. So moving now to the next slide, when it comes to the positions of non-governmental stakeholders, not surprisingly, trade unions and workers' organizations have expressed serious reservations when it comes to temporary labor migration. for the reason that they're sometimes seen as filling permanent jobs with temporary workers, but also because of the limitations on certain rights when it comes to freedom of association, for example, or that certain more vulnerable group of workers are more likely to be at risk of exploitation. And not surprisingly, civil society at the global level very much endorses many of these concerns. When it comes to the employers of the private sector, they focus mainly on temporary migration as a means of filling skill needs, also on ensuring more efficient immigration systems so they can get workers quickly into jobs without the administrative obstacles that are often there when it comes to immigration regulation. But where their concerns dovetail with the concerns of workers and civil society is that employers actually do not just focus on highly skilled migration, but also are concerned with filling all skilled needs, including for lower skilled workers or so-called essential workers. And finally, how is temporary labor migration depicted in the Global Compact on migration? So this is the next two slides, thank you. And the next slide, please. So this is the final slide. And here, the Global Compact, of course, is seen as the most comprehensive global framework addressing all aspects of international migration. Importantly, though, even though it's non-binding and describes itself as a cooperative framework, it does rest on international law. So the legal frameworks I've just referred to are very much relevant. And also the compact is rooted in the 2000 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Temporary and circular migration feature in the compact, and particularly when it comes to Objective 5 on flexible pathways for regular migration, as well as Objective 22 on portability of social security. However, what we see in Objective 5 in particular is that labor mobility schemes, as they're referred to, are seen in broader terms to include, and I've quoted here from the Objective 5, flexible, convertible, and non-discriminatory permit options, such as for permanent and temporary work. Whereas Objective 22 also calls for the integration of social security and agreements, including those on long-term migration and temporary labor migration. So essentially, in conclusion, what this paper tries to show is that with the adoption of the global compacts, the policy debates on international migration have come full circle in the sense that there is now a clearer recognition that both temporary and permanent employment is a legitimate policy objective when it comes to enhancing regular migration pathways as defined in GCM Objective 5. And also a greater recognition that the rights of migrant workers engaged in temporary labor migration need to be safeguarded. So I think even though there's quite a lot of criticism of the compact and there are big question marks with regard to its effective implementation, it does take a more holistic view of migration at the global level and gives more recognition to permanent migration as a legitimate way of meeting policy objectives in the GCM and not just focusing on temporary labor migration in the context of migration and development. Because there, and according to the ILO also, there are risks, of course, that that kind of looking at migration in that context can be seen as very instrumental and risks, essentially violating, if you like, the ILO constitutional principle that labor is not a commodity. So that's a very, in a nutshell, a broad overview of the paper that I worked on for the book. Thank you, Felicitas.
Thank you so much, Richard, for your presentation and for reminding us to labor is not a commodity and to the Global Compact of Migration. Very much appreciated. I would hand over to Daniel immediately because we are already short of time. Thank you. Daniel, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks very much. And let me just attempt to share my screen here. Thanks to the organizers for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it was an honor to be part of this book. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, one of the major flaws that have been identified in temporary visa programs, temporary labor migration programs, whatever term you want to use. I'll probably use both of those interchangeably. And that is the fact that it's difficult for migrants to change employers. And that, of course, leads to them being in a sort of quasi-indentured status. And leads to many problems in terms of freedom of association, being able to complain about labor violations, etc. And so there it is. So just a quick note on those kind of numbers, what numbers look like in terms of temporary work visa programs in the US. The last major change was in 1990 in terms of the legal framework and the statute. And so the programs mostly look like what they were turned into in 1990. And as you can see, the growth has been almost exponential in these programs. It's happened through Republican and Democratic administrations. And part of why these numbers can increase is because there are really only numerical limits on 2 of the programs. There's one big dip you see there near the right that had to do with the bureaucratic shutdowns during the pandemic, and so almost 1.8 million new visas issued in the programs that allow work, as well as this also includes spouses and children that can come with those primary workers. But the actual true number of workers is much higher. In 2019, we had over 2 million, almost 2.1 million temporary migrant workers who came into the U.S. And you can see 2016 was the last year of the Obama administration. 2019 was right before the pandemic under Trump. The number of workers actually increased by 13% during that period. So in terms of what's been offered as a main solution, and it's usually discussed as a sort of main solution to fix temporary labor migration programs, to make them, consistent with human and labor rights, it's been to have portability, meaning allowing a worker to change jobs and change employers. You have tech CEOs saying that if they can change jobs, the free market will sort of fix the situation. You have Michael Clemens, a well-known development economist, saying that tying workers to single employers is the biggest flaw, and that it's a critical protection to let them change jobs, and it'll make sure the law is complied with. You have someone like Alex Narasti, who is I'd say a corporate extremist libertarian, saying that allowing visa portability will incentivize good behavior, act as an enforcement mechanism, allow workers to regulate their own work environment. So basically, you have people on all sides of the debate agreeing that portability, is something positive. But they also seem to suggest, I think, that it's the only thing that's really needed to be changed, that will fix the programs. And so, does portability equal decent work? Will portability lead to human and labor rights in these programs? I try to take a critical look at this in the chapter. And I think because temporary labor migration, at least in the United States, is here to stay, given the makeup in Congress, it's more important than ever to get these governance structures right. Then, there's not much research that's been done on the, impact and value of portability. We have evidence that shows that workers in visa programs, often earn lower wages than similarly situated workers, and we have studies showing that workers who move to a green card, to a permanent residence from a visa, often earn higher wages. But the research is limited, and hopefully there will be more as more data comes out on this. And so to sum up what I say in the chapter, and I have way too many more slides than I can actually show, so I'm just going to give you a real summary here. I think that in the U.S. there's a real there's a real spectrum of portability. There is some portability in these programs, but we have dozens of programs, and each one has its own, industries that use it and its own corporate lobbies. And so I think I sort of sum up and say that the types of portability and the programs break down into three essential categories. You have programs that have limited portability, so there is technically portability, but it's mostly on paper and it's difficult in practice. And then you have programs that have some portability, but there are middlemen involved, such as a university or a private organization, which makes it difficult in practice. And we have examples of this. And then you have some that have almost near total portability. And so the chapter goes through, gives examples of each, and really end up showing that despite this portability and despite increased portability in recent years, and new policy innovations, violations and abuses really are still common despite these changes. And so I'll just skip through and say, even in some of these programs where there's new portability, we saw one of the biggest cases in U.S. history of human trafficking involving one of the programs, H-2A programs, the H-2A program where 70,000 H-2A workers were involved. You've got a study that just came out not long ago, or an investigative report showing that in one state, 1 out of every 10 employers, 10% of employers are violating the laws and are repeat violators. So you really, and then you see in the program that had the most portability, probably the TN visa, you have people being recruited to be doctors and veterinarians who end up working on dairies, milking cows, and shoveling manure, literally. And so in sum, I kind of argue that portability on its own is not enough. It's the bare minimum for a program that is consistent with basic human and labor rights. It's sort of the starting point. And so governance frameworks leave too many ways for workers to be hurt. And so we need other innovations. We need portability. Plus, I think we need to revise temporary work visa program rules to have higher wages, more transparency in recruitment and job offers so that workers can change jobs. You need paths to permanent residence to reduce the time that workers are temporary. New protections from retaliation are needed. And you need to appropriate more funding for labor standards enforcement because the Labor Department actually is not involved in many of these programs, which is part of the problem. And I'm running low on time, so I'm going to just, this is my last slide. I'll just sort of quickly summarize this. Just some recent developments I wanted to mention, as well as what's happening under the Trump era. We had a new quote unquote H2 modernization rule for the lower wage programs, the H2A and H2B, created a more streamlined process for changing employers, but it's still not going to be easy for workers to find jobs because there's not enough transparency and the government hasn't created a sort of system to undergird it so that workers can change jobs. And the program might not even survive because of the Trump administration changing it or because of court challenges. Then you had one of the best innovations during the Biden administration was deferred action for labor enforcement. This led to 2 years of deferred action, basically protection from deportation, plus an open work permit when workers were involved in some sort of labor dispute or had a labor complaint. And it was really successful under Biden. Thousands of workers got protection, both workers on visas and irregular workers. But it's hard to see that surviving under Trump. And then you have the reality of what's happening with our government, the U.S. government right now, with the major cuts that are happening from Elon Musk and Doge. Basically, labor standards enforcement is going to be cut at the same time that immigration enforcement, the amount of money spent on it and the tactics are going to be increasing and getting more draconian. Right now, you have a low number of labor investigators due already to some of these cuts. And then the final point is, the deportations that are happening in the United States, increased deportations and the revocation of status and protections and work permits that people have is leading to, workers not being able to work lawfully, which is creating a lot of pressure on employers to increase temporary migration programs. And under the first Trump administration, you saw permanent pathways get cut, but temporary work visa programs increased. And now Trump has made statements that are even more friendly to increasing the programs. And so, sorry, I went over time, and I'll stop there and hand it back over.
So much, Daniel, for this insights, also with this very fresh view on the Trump administration. I hand over to Mrs. Segati, Aurelia. And then we still have Jenna, and I think I skipped the presentation on Germany. I'll keep it very short. Please, Aurelia, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much to the organizers, and thank you again to Christiane and Fabiola for having me as part of this important volume. So my chapter speaks about temporary labor migration from North Africa to Europe, and it's looking at it from a longer term perspective that's really trying to draw on historical legacies and use this to interrogate what I call future dilemmas. So perhaps something stating the obvious as an introduction, but North African countries are currently experiencing a surge in demand for low-skilled labor, which is driven primarily by the EU member states' need for workers in sectors such as agriculture, tourism, hospitality, and non-medical care. And this trend is expected to continue for another at least decade. And what I found interesting is that it revives historical patterns of labor migration between North Africa and Europe, which have been shaped by formal bilateral agreements, including some of the world's most comprehensive social security agreements. However, in spite of this historical legacy, North African migrant workers continue to face significant challenges, including very exploitative working conditions, precarious employment, and limited social protection. So what I try to do in this chapter is to look not just at the immediate protection issues, but to look at the socioeconomic future of North African migrant workers, and to try and explore the kind of conditions which may undermine households' cohesion, children's education, pension security. And I draw on experience from the field, working as ILO labor migration and mobility specialist in North African countries, in which the governments, while recognizing the immediate dangers of exposing their workforce to unsafe working conditions and being increasingly conscious about this, very often fail to fully consider the longer-term repercussions and the mechanisms which are put in place, whether by the EU at the level of the Commission or the member states, or by the North African governments, continue to be lacking in terms of actual protection. And I focus in particular on social protection in this paper. So the chapter identifies three key variables shaping contemporary labor migration from North Africa to Europe. Firstly, labor demand from the European private sector, and of course the dynamics of global value chains attached to this. Secondly, migration policy fluctuations among EU member states. And lastly, what is not so often considered in relation with the previous two, the diplomatic and employment strategies of North African countries in managing migration flows. So basically, the argument in the chapter is that while migration has re-emerged as a strategic approach to employment for North African countries and labor management for EU member states, there's still vastly insufficient attention and resources devoted to both immediate worker protections and long-term development strategies. The chapter also insists on looking into these issues, not just from the perspective of formal temporary labor migration, but also considering irregular short-term mobility and private sector initiatives straddling formal and informal labor markets, and looking at this in terms of a continuum of different channels for temporary labor migration. So basically, the chapter structure is fourfold. In the first two sections, I analyze European labor market needs. I look into available statistics from, in particular, France, Spain, and Italy. And then in the second section, I sort of provide an overview of temporary labor migration flows from North Africa. I try to show that the current situation is somewhat of a paradox. On the one hand, there are increasing data and analysis, including from EU institutions, such as the Joint Research Council, recognizing declining demographic trends in EU labor markets and labor force. Even though this question of labor shortages is very debated, as we know, particularly by the unions, but nevertheless recognizing the long-term structural trends. And on the other hand, EU member states, as we can see across Europe at the moment, have increasingly been faced with xenophobic attitudes and promoted very often as political platform by far right-wing parties, which in turn reduces the scope for more longer-term immigration schemes. And in this context, paradoxically, the temporary labor migration schemes have been on the increase again since the early 2010s. So this is what I explore further in the paper. In the next section, looking in depth at different protection measures which have been adopted at the EU Commission level, at the member states level, by North African countries. I look into what's been put in place in public employment services in Morocco, in Tunisia. I look at the attempts at regulating better private employment agencies, improving recruitment transparency. And I also look into efforts at the level of social partners, in particular trade unions. Then the last section really looks into long-term socioeconomic and developmental implications, trying to build on a number of studies which suggest very clearly that temporary migration often results in either a neutral or negative effect rather than the positive outcomes promoted by the so-called triple win model, in terms of lack of sustainable reintegration programs, in terms of instability of migrant households, and a real dependency on seasonal migration for lack of access to finances, vocational training, employment opportunities. I look at gender-specific barriers, and also I sort of deep dive in particular into social protection gaps, building there too on both studies on the European side, as well as first-hand observations and research that we've conducted in North Africa. To conclude, 4 key points of conclusion in this chapter. First of all, whether the right-wing parties in Europe like it or not, labor migration from North Africa to Europe is a long-term trend, is there to stay for a while. And it's very important that it be addressed as it should, building on the very rich and very interesting legacy of previous bilateral labor agreements and social security agreements. Second, it's important to consider it using, from the perspective of what I call three channels of temporary labor migration, which coexist. It is good and important to look at the formal channels, the formal schemes, and there's a need for more research on these. But it's also very important to look at the continuum of private sector driven initiatives. And I don't think there is enough research on this, which, as I was saying earlier, straddle, formal and informal labor markets, as well as illicit underground recruitment, mafia type networks, if you like, on which there is research, but which by definition are extremely difficult to measure. But I think that looking at the three together is an important attempt. Thirdly, there's a need for, and it's been said again and again, investment in regular migration pathways, and in particular, reintegration programs which look into temporary labor migration, in particular from two angles, looking at what it does to workers who are away from home 6 to sometimes 9 months of the year, and how a particular worker, incorporates this in one's life, but also looking at it longer term. And this is really where social protection comes in. And that's my fourth and final point. What happened to these workers after 15, sometimes 20 years of back and forth between the country of origin and country of destination through these temporary labor migration schemes, so-called temporary labor migration schemes, and how can we really beef up, expand, and reinforce existing social security agreements. The good news being that the social security systems in all of North African countries are expanding and are really consolidating, strengthening, and offer completely new possibilities for social rights portability. So I'll end here, and I hope you want to read the chapter as a whole, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aurelia, for your presentation, all of the speakers of this book, the authors. And it was in the chat, but of course the book is free for downloading on the ILO homepage. And we will also have a link on our homepage on this. I would invite our last speaker now on the Canadian perspective, Jenna, if you would like to step up.
Thank you so much. Mixed blessing of having the opportunity of being the last speaker here,
Yeah.
especially after so many incredible speakers. I'm going to take a few minutes to reflect on what I see as a particularly troubling trend emerging, and that actually has been emerging, I'd say, for about a decade, but it's certainly ramping up at this point. And I see this as part of a lot of different trends in migration at the moment, migration governance especially, looking at, in particular, what I see as a temporalization of migration. So, and that this temporalization is happening with, key lines around gender, around race, with the hierarchy of rights, and it has different outcomes for different people. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. I'll use Canada as an example as I go. I've been researching and publishing on temporary migration in Canada since 2001. I've been a witness numerous times in House of Commons and Senate and human rights tribunals. I know the issues very well and do a lot of empirical work with civil society and migrant workers themselves. A lot of my work has been on agriculture and in low-wage occupations, some with caregivers and international students. So much of what I'm going to say comes from that empirical work, and then also from a forthcoming edited volume on a handbook on temporary migration I am publishing with Edward Alger. So this idea of temporalization is, of course, the numbers, right? We see the numbers of temporary migration numbers increasing. We know that we have large numbers of migrants worldwide, 304 million international migrants. And looking at a estimate of 167, obviously that's a bit outdated, but roughly 167 million migrants in the labor force, looking at a significant increase over from 30 million in 2013. So that's really kind of what I'm looking at there, the numbers that are being categorized as temporary migrant workers. But we don't really know what temporary is in terms of the data, and that's increasingly a challenge, right? We could talk about migrant workers, and even that, trying to figure out how that categories gets measured from country to country, very, very different. So there's a real challenge in really getting a good sense of what that estimate is and what's being counted, and how that variability is across states. In Canada, we know we're talking about roughly 3 million people right now in Canada that are living in Canada with temporary permits. And this represents roughly 6.5% of the population. And our total population is around 40 million. And we know, for example, that based on some new changes that have been made, there's roughly 1.2 million people with temporary permits who are those permits are going to expire this year alone. And that group largely doesn't have a pathway to permanent residency. I'll talk about that in a sec. So we've seen the numbers increase. We've seen the numbers of temporary migration schemes increase, which the previous speaker just mentioned, and a few other people were talking about. We've seen an increase in number of BLAs, bilateral labor agreements, that have been used for the governance of some and the management of some of those labor migration flows. I've categorized and created a database of over 300 of those. So we've seen a complexification and also a proliferation of categories and streams. Canada provides a good example of this. We have the permanent migration system that has things like a point system to be able to come in permanently as a skilled worker and enter in that way. We have ways to enter in as family reunification, but we actually have this really massive two buckets of temporary residents and ways to enter as temporary residents. We have the International Mobility Program, which is high-wage workers, intercompany transferees, postgraduate work permits, visas under trade agreements, workers in professional occupation. Then we have the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, which actually originated in the early 1960s. There were two streams then about non-immigrant employment scheme, as well as the seasonal agriculture worker program in the late 60s and early 70s was developed. And so it was expanded in 2005, in the 2000s roughly, but in 2005 it really ballooned to include a whole bunch of different categories. We also saw, before that, we saw in the 80s, pardon me, a growth of another sectoral category, the use of a caregiver program. And so we've seen these different streams develop over time, and now we actually have quite a plethora. We have underneath the international mobility stream, we have those. We have the under temporary foreign worker, we have agricultural workers, we have seasonal agricultural workers, we have what used to be called the global talent stream, low wage, high wage, caregivers, and then we have students. So we have all these different types of categories. And each of them tend to come with their own little packages of access to rights or not, right? And so they'll have differential kind of realities for workers and for migrants and people themselves. And increasingly, you would think it would be easier, you would think it'd be easier to move horizontally between category and category. And we were seeing some of that for a period of time, but increasingly we're seeing truncated pathways where people come on a temporary permit and then have no access to permanent residency or the ability to move into a different permit easily happening. So we're actually creating a system where we have more and more people in precarious employment, more and more people without status. Our new immigration plan, actually announced in 2025, was trying to decrease the number of people on temporary permits because it's been a largely employer-driven, I would not call it labor demand, I would call it labor desire driven, for a number of good reasons. From the perspective of employers, flexibilization of the workers, they live on site quite often, generally problems of accessing collective bargaining rights and not having those rights protected. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why we've seen it explode. Usually those are from the perspective of employers trying to benefit from this program. And so we've seen a real expansion in this period of time of those in those circumstances. We've also seen an increase of the use globally, I think, and trying to track some of this now, the use of temporary permits beyond workers, right? So temporary permits for alternatives to PR, for alternatives to for resettling refugees, alternatives to asylum process. So if someone also has been experienced extreme exploitation, like trafficking in Canada, they will be given an open work permit for vulnerable workers, which is a way, instead of providing them access to permanent residency, to help them handle the serious legal case they might be facing, they'll be given a short-term work permit, which effectively means they still have to leave. And so we're seeing is a lot more of these use of these temporary schemes as a way to block, truncate, control, and in many ways a kind of interdiction towards not providing full access to rights. And so this I think there's been the proliferation of numbers and categories, but also this normalization and logic of temporalization, which we saw in the GCM, as Richard rightly pointed out. We saw in the UN Network for Migration, and I think Neha was on that committee early on as well with me. Originally, there was one of the work streams was focused, for example, on regular pathways. By the time we had the first IMRF, it was actually called the Bilateral Labor Migration or Labor Agreement Working Group, right? So it was all about turning regular pathways were actually temporary migration to pathways. So we've also seen, I see that it's led to more precarization, more vulnerabilization of workers, that we have the narratives being used to kind of underpin this, the sort of earn and return idea that they're only going to stay for a couple of years, that they're going to receive training and brain skills and then go back and use that for development. But really what we're seeing is that that there's a real gap between the assumptions and aims of these policies and the realities of migrants' lives. To come back to one of the questions that posed by Felicitas at the outset, I mean, the real socioeconomic, but also social costs, the health costs borne by these migrants is significant. It's either delaying their ability to get full access to rights, making it impossible in some cases, particularly those that are on closed work permits or tied work permits with employers, which, by the way, is a significant problem in Canada. Or it's putting off that process of potentially getting access to permanent residency and delaying integration and family reunification for long periods of time, which has significant costs. Also, health consequences are significant, particularly those that are concentrated in agriculture, where we see high rates of accidents and injuries. We see difficulty claiming employment protections, often in agriculture. Well, in agriculture in Canada, migrant workers have real challenges because they're not covered under the Employment Standard Act in the same way. There's no protection of collective bargaining rights that are uniform across provinces, and we face real challenges with workers being basically sent home if they are entering into a labor dispute or make any complaints. And this is a program that's been longstanding for 50 years and very little has changed. I could talk about that program alone, a whole course, but we can entertain questions if we have. So if we have time. So basically, these are the things I see happening around this temporalization. It has real consequences, in terms of being able to access fair and decent employment. I mean, when we think about what decent employment is, being able to have the aspirations of people in their working lives be realized, fair income, full realization of rights. We're not seeing that through any of the temporary programs we have in Canada, and very few are being able to access full rights over time. We have lots of evidence of exploitation, abuse, health consequences, difficulty in accessing collective bargaining rights. All of this is culminated in recent years with the UN Special Rapporteur on the Contemporary Forms of Slavery coming to Canada and saying we have a system that is serving as a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery. We've got the recent Amnesty International report talking about the use of close work permits being akin to slavery. And so we're seeing a huge recognition that the system's not working. And so without any direct pathway to permanent residency, we're seeing this breeding ground for rights violations that have really disproportionate outcomes for racialized migrants, for women especially. So when looking ahead, to wrap things up, I think, while temporary migration is clearly desirable for states for some of the reasons we've talked about here today, I think it's a real false construct. I think it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. I think to structure migration as temporary inherently leads to rights violations. And I would basically argue that at this stage, you can't have fair or just labor migration in the way it's currently being governed. Whether it's a BLA, whether it's any type of these initiatives, it's not doing enough because migration in the context of inequality will inherently deepen that inequality, dependency, and precarity. I think much more needs to be done to move us ahead beyond trying to do a bunch of tweaks and fixes and band-aids to the way temporary migration is being currently governed. I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Jenna, for your insights to Canada. I was wondering, I mean, it was a rather pessimistic view you showed us here. Are such instruments such as IRIS and fair migration attempts not working on the ground? Is it what you're telling us?
I'm saying in a country like Canada, where we're having dialogue about this, when we're aware of what these initiatives are, when we've signed on to numerous conventions, we're still not seeing it translate. We're not seeing it translate into workers being able to have full realization of rights and access to decent work.
Thank you so much. I would say that we skip the German viewpoint here at this point because we need a bit of time for discussion also. I will upload the presentation which I have prepared, and then you can check it then. But I would right go into the discussion.